Well, hi, Steve. It is so great to have you on one of these Skoll Center Oxford Net Zero Rockstar conversations. Thank you for taking the time. We're going to go through a few just quick questions so people who are listening can get a sense of who you are and what you're doing.
Great. No, great to be here. What's the kind of audience for these then?
Well, these are going to be going up on the Skoll Center website, and we hope will also be cross-posted through the Oxford Net Zero Network. So we're hoping to have a range of people who are interested in innovation, entrepreneurship, net zero, and ultimately how we can take action to address these interconnected emergencies. But really, it's also about profiling the amazing work that you and your colleagues at Oxford Net Zero are doing, and for the people who are listening to just get a chance to get to know you a little bit better. And maybe we can jump in with the first question, Steve. I would love to hear a little bit more about your journey. So how did you first become involved in work around climate? And is there something in your story or in your journey that you'd like to share that we wouldn't otherwise see on your CV or your LinkedIn profile?
Well, I guess growing up as a teenager, I was a science geek. I was really into physics, chemistry, maths, all that kind of stuff at school, and into sci-fi growing up. So I always had in my mind that I would be doing science in some shape or form with my life. I thought, I'd do the PhD and become a research scientist, ideally. I guess growing up, I studied physics at university, at Oxford actually, and I increasingly felt like, although the kind of really big picture science that I loved as a kid, Einstein's theory of relativity, space travel, all that stuff was super exciting. I increasingly felt like I wanted to use my scientific knowledge to do something that was useful in society. And this was at a point actually, it's about 20 years ago now, where climate change was recognized as an issue, but it not nearly at the level of societal engagement and government engagement that we have now. And it wasn't even like a module in the physics course. There was a tiny little bit in an optional one about how planets work, and there was a little bit of climate change tucked in that Miles Allen was giving the lectures on actually. But that got me interested, and then I went on to do a PhD in atmospheric physics. I guess what drives me really is I actually kind of like the scientific problems, and the kind of useful to society bit comes second. I mean, I'm guided, I guess, by my values and my faith. So I'm a Christian, and it feels important for me to do certain things, right from that perspective. But it was actually the problem solving side of it, and how the atmosphere works and how we actually understand the climate changing and why that first got me into this.
Oh, it's super interesting to hear of your story, Steve. I wonder, in the work that you're doing right now, where do you go to get inspiration? Like, where are the sources of energy you kind of tap into to do this sort of very quite heavy lifting and important work?
Yeah, so I mean, my journey hasn't been a straight one since doing the PhD. I haven't been a research scientist all the time. I've actually worked in government for about a decade, so very much kind of open plan offices. And then, of course, in this last year of lockdown, very much working in this spare room here in my house. So getting inspiration has been a bit of a challenge, actually, because I would say open plan offices and spare bedrooms is not where I get my inspiration. I'd say when I want to have space to think big thoughts and try and get away from emails and get into the big picture stuff, I really like having the space to read, and I really like having the space to talk to other experts. I think the times when I've been happiest in my working life have been when I've been in a group together of trusted experts where everyone knows their role and they have complementary skills. So I really like working in a multidisciplinary environment. I've worked a lot with economists, systems engineers, policy experts, as well as other physicists and scientists. Someone likened it once to me as the A team, which is a slightly dated reference, but that kind of small crack team where everyone knows their place and they're good at something. So I get my energy from working in those kind of teams and bouncing ideas off each other, as well as kind of, I think I'm a bit of an introvert. So then having that time to step away and digest and come up with some fully thought out ideas to share with that team.
Well, I love the idea of the A team. I kind of have that music now, that soundtrack kind of going through that
Sorry
those
about that.
80s soundtrack kind of going through my mind. And I would love to be a fly on the wall of some of those conversations you have with your experts that you're working with and sort of some of those big ideas. Well, maybe that's a nice segue into my next question for you, which are, what are some of the big questions you are exploring right now in your research?
Yeah, so as I said, I've moved through policy land, and I'm increasingly, or have been for a while, really interested in the societal questions and the kind of questions about how we as humans and as a society actually deal with the climate challenge, rather than just the kind of pure scientific modeling of the climate system. So a few of the big things I'm involved in at the moment are, well, the Oxford Net Zero Initiative. I'm executive director of that. So I have a role to kind of look across all the work that we're doing with that. And of course, you're involved in that, Shah, doing fantastic work engaging with business. Part of what I'm working with is with Tom Hale on net zero targets, which have really kind of been supercharged over the last year. We've seen this absolute explosion of not just countries, but corporates, companies, cities, and regions saying we pledge to reach net zero emissions as part of our efforts to tackle climate change. And we're really interested in how many there are, but also what that actually means. So how robust are these targets? Because it's very easy on one level to say we're going to hit net zero in 30 years' time. But what are you actually putting in place to achieve that? And what are you defining by net zero? It's really the Wild West out there in terms of what that means and how people are going about it. So that's one big question, the kind of what do net zero targets look like and what should they look like? And then how are people doing against that? Within that, there's a lot of discussion about the net in net zero. So this idea that it includes not just emissions reductions, but also potentially some offsetting, but also greenhouse gas removal or carbon dioxide removal, which is this idea that as well as reducing emissions, we increasingly are finding ways to take the CO2 that's already in the air and take it back out. And there are a whole menagerie of different ways of doing that, from the very well-known, well-understood and simple planting trees, which is not really a new idea, still a great idea, right through to some really high-tech ways that people are working on taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So one of my other really big research question is, what are the methods for doing that, and how do we scale them up rapidly, but also in a way that's responsible and is additional to emissions reduction, so helps us accelerate rather than seeing this as a kind of trade-off or alternative between the two.
Well, so can I just follow up on that one a little bit? Because one of the things that some of our listeners of this program might be interested in is about the application and adoption of some of these research practices when it comes to business. So I wondered if you could sort of double click a little bit about how you see this research work that you're leading being applied by businesses.
Okay, so on the net zero target side, I think we're finding, as you know, Shah, that a lot of businesses just have a lot of questions about how net zero is the kind of exciting big picture game in town, but what does it actually mean? And most are still thinking super near term about the resourcing they have and their bottom line in terms of just switching to a green electricity provider, or maybe thinking about electric cars. But getting to net zero involves doing all of that super quickly, and then going through a whole load of really deep, knotty issues around how we use land, the kind of process emissions from really fundamental things we make, like iron and steel and cement and plastics, and then thinking about removals and thinking about what it means to responsibly incentivize action, beyond just your own immediate fence of what you're responsible for. So what is the role of offsetting? And offsetting's become this huge thing as well. So I think there's real applications in terms of trying to help organizations, which is countries as well as companies, think through how to set net zero targets well so that they guide the right sort of actions, and they use it as a way of thinking about the broader range of options beyond just the kind of obvious ones that get talked about. And then on the greenhouse gas removal stuff specifically, I guess there are several groups involved here. I mean, there's a huge role for government. So a lot of my work, and given my background, is engaging with governments, because I think taking CO2 out of the atmosphere is a global good. There's no market value for the CO2. So there's very little incentive for people to do it unless they want to plant trees because they love trees, or for a few other fringe benefits that some removals approaches give. But there's a huge role for just thinking through what's the government structure for incentivizing these things and regulating them. But then with companies, I'd say that you can probably divide up companies into three camps on this stuff. There are the companies that are actually trying to do removals, plant more trees on their land, or they're, a bioenergy plant makes liquid fuels from crops or combined heat and power from forest residues or whatever. And if they can capture that CO2 and bury it, they become a removal company themselves. So they're thinking about how can we scale our product, which helps the climate. You have a second category of companies, which is we won't do removals ourselves, but we see that this is really important as part of our wider strategy, and we want to help incentivize them. So what are the good projects we can invest in, and how do we invest in to scale them up, and how does that interlink with our own strategy? And there are companies like Microsoft, Stripe, Shopify, others that are really at the forefront of that kind of thinking. And then there's the massive group of other companies which just doesn't even know about this, doesn't care about it, doesn't think about it. And that's fine. There's always going to be a certain number of those companies. But I think increasingly, as we get serious about reaching net zero, which we have to do to stabilize global temperature, we're going to need to involve more companies and countries and governments in the conversation.
Well, so that brings me on to sort of my next question, Steve, and maybe just briefly, based on those sort of three categories, if you could choose like which of those groups that you would really want to focus on working with, and maybe that's a company or an industry within those categories, which one are you feeling called to, knowing that obviously we need to work with all three, but with the research you're doing, which companies or industries within those sort of categories are you most excited about or interested in working alongside?
It's a great question. I'm not sure that I have that kind of clear. Part of what I want to do over the next few months and years, with the help of people like you who are much more integrated in the business community, is find actually where the really important levers are. I guess one thing that's in my mind is that there are quite a suite of new approaches to removal coming out that are quite high tech, and I think there's a lot of scope for them to come down in cost and become really effective with the right support. So I think working on that high tech side of removal is a really exciting. And that's both with the people who are trying to develop the technology, so be the removal companies themselves, but also the people who are interested in supporting those as part of their portfolio of climate action. And they're currently very expensive. They're currently very small scale. So this is not to say that they're just going to solve the problem overnight and we don't need to worry about reducing emissions. If we want to get to net zero, we're going to need to reduce all the emissions we can and do all this removal that we can as well. It's pretty clear when you look at the kind of potential to do both that we can just about scrape net zero based on what we know at the moment doing all of these things. So I think working with some of those high tech companies is really exciting. That's not to say there isn't a role for planting trees and putting more carbon in soil. That's always going to be super important as well. But I think it's a really exciting time for innovation on the tech front here.
Okay, well, I want to ask maybe two more quick questions before we let you get on with your important day of important work. We are in the midst still of a global pandemic, and health has become an increasingly important topic for us all to be reflecting on. Global health, health of us as people, our health systems. And I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about where you see the intersection of climate and health systems work coming together.
Yeah, there definitely is an intersection. It's something I did a bit of work on when I was working for the Committee on Climate Change, actually looking at the co-benefits and also the potential trade-offs between the human and actual ecosystem health agenda and the emissions reduction agenda. There are a couple of low carbon actions which give you massive wins on health, or a small number, maybe more than two. If you switch from combusting fossil fuels generally to anything which doesn't involve emissions, then you massively improve air quality. And so you reduce the rates of people having breathing difficulties, pulmonary, coronary issues. So the obvious places where that comes into play are on the roads where you have people and vehicles close together. Switching to electric cars gives you a big win there. You don't completely eliminate air pollution because you still get some from tire wear and rubber wear, but you cut out the whole exhaust pipe issue. So there's a massive win when we decarbonize transport on the air quality agenda, which improves health. Also, actually, indoor air quality is a massive thing. People often don't think about that as much as outdoor. But when you have a gas boiler and a gas hob, you probably know you've got to have a carbon monoxide sensor in there. There are bad things that can happen. But also you get little particulates from incomplete combustion of the gas. So if you switch to electric cooking, we got an induction hob. It's brilliant. We love it. And that's also better for air quality. Just very, very briefly, I think that there's the diets agenda. So a low carbon diet is, or a healthy diet is also a low carbon diet generally. We eat too much meat, not enough vegetables. So you can improve there. I can improve there. And I think more active travel. So not just driving in cars, but cycling, walking, you get the health benefits. They don't solve the whole picture in terms of that. They're not always the biggest wins in terms of cutting emissions, but you can get big health wins. And I think overall, the signs are that you get a double win. So a climate benefit is an overall health benefit in doing this.
Well, I have to say it feels really positive to hear that there are these really quite clear intersections as you've articulated them coming through. And I feel like that's going to be a really interesting place to continue to focus as we see more and more of the world looking at both health systems and climate systems. And that hopefully that intersection will become even more closely intertwined. Two last questions. I know I said two last time, but here's the last two ones. And I think they're quite sort of punchy. So react just sort of quite spontaneously here, Steve. We know that Oxford is obviously a place where a lot of young, bright minds gravitate towards. And so if we have some young people that are listening to this conversation, I wonder if you have one or two pieces of advice or ideas for them to be thinking about as they embark in sort of the earlier stages of their journey right now.
Wow. Cool. Great question. I'll attempt to answer that quickly, but that's such a rich question. I think, so I went through the experience of being an undergraduate at Oxford, a student at Oxford. Absolutely loved it. I also remember some intensely, incredibly stressful, hard times. So I think you're suddenly surrounded, you probably come to Oxford used to being an overachiever, top of your class. And then you're bumped in with everyone else who is also used to being top of their class. And not everyone can be top of their class, right? So I'd say it's a fantastic opportunity to learn across different disciplines. So as a scientist, I was hanging out with art students all the time. And I just loved having that really rounded education. But also I'd say, you've got to not let that pressure get to you. You be you, you push yourself, but recognize that, someone else's path is not necessarily your path. And if you're not top of the class all the time, well, welcome to what most of the rest of the world feels.
I like that. You be you.
and the second thing I'd say is, don't get too hung up on setting your career path right now for the rest of your life. So mine has been really unusual and I've loved it. So I went from thinking I was going to be a scientist to working in policy to coming back to academia. I don't know what my path will be later on, but I've found that you are more flexible than you realize and you have more transferable skills than you realize. And even for me, as someone who wanted to be, an expert in science, I found that when I went from PhD to being landed into the Committee on Climate Change, this new organization doing policy, I actually did all right, even though it was way outside my comfort zone. So your career will take twists and turns. Just take the opportunities where you find them and see what happens.
I like that. You be you and see what happens and go for those opportunities. Those are great words of wisdom and experience. So thank you, Steve. Last question. I promise this is the last question. We earlier talked about, places of inspiration. And again, I still have the A-Team song kind of going through my head now. But I wonder, when it comes to really thinking through the music that you use to sort of power up, get excited, what sort of music do you really enjoy listening to that sort of gets you in the zone for the kind of work that you do at Oxford Net Zero?
I haven't used music enough. If you told me a year ago that I was going to spend a year in my spare bedroom, with a Sonos speaker in the background, I would have said I'd have it on all the time. But the truth is, there've been so many meetings that I haven't listened to enough music. But when I have been listening to music, maybe it's a kind of comfort thing with lockdown. I've returned to a lot of albums and music I listened to a long time ago. So I haven't been exploring so much new. But when I was a kid, so I played drums a little bit. I used to play the trumpet. That was my main instrument. So I played in kind of school orchestras and big bands, got quite a wide range of music and loved music. That was my other thing as well as science. But I listened to a lot of like acid jazz and funk and James Brown and stuff like that. So this is real soul bearing moment. This is like the most personal question of it all, isn't it? But I've been getting back into some of that stuff recently.
Oh, I love it. Well, I am going to have the A team in my mind, but I'm also going to have a little bit of acid jazz. And I think I might tune into some later on today. So
Yes,
I think one of the things might be fun is actually we might create almost like a little bit of a Spotify playlist of all the different music that different people are using and listening to, whether it's in their speaker in the background or, you know, when they're going for runs. Because I think, you know, getting to know people's music tastes is actually also a really wonderful way to get insight into sort of what moves people.
Yeah, very briefly, a friend of mine said he's been getting in touch with old friends during lockdown, and the way he's been getting in touch is say, tell me about an album that you've really enjoyed recently. I'll listen to it, then we'll meet up and we can talk about that.
Oh, I love it. It's kind of like a book club, but actually not having to read full books and rather just listening. I like that idea. That might actually become another question we add to these interviews. So thank you, Steve. And thank you not just for your music choice, but for spending the time today having this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I know if anybody who's listening to this conversation is interested in learning more, they can follow you and your work by just really tuning into the activities and the strategy and the amazing work that's is in development and is already in flow at Oxford Net Zero. So thank you so much, Steve. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next Oxford Net Zero meeting soon.
Thank you. Great to see you too. My pleasure.